I'm not an atheist anymore, because I don't look at the world that way anymore. I'm not a materialist anymore. I don't think the world's made out of matter. I think it's made out of what matters. It's made out of meaning. Look at it from the perspective of modern brain science. What we orient towards unconsciously, which means what captures our attention, is meaning, and it captures our attention before we know what it is. Sweden and the Scandinavian countries are the closest to gender-free countries that have ever been produced. And the consequence of that with regards to certain occupations is precisely and absolutely the opposite of what the social constructionists would have predicted. The gender differences have got bigger. They're bigger for interest, they're bigger for occupational choice, and they're bigger for personality.
Do we know why?
Well, the woman in the documentary said it properly. What happens is that if you flatten out environmental variability, you reduce it to zero, all that's left is biological variability, so it maximizes. And one way of thinking about that is that that allows people to follow their innate predispositions. And that can't be dismissed as a story. There's tens of thousands of people who've participated in these studies. And the most important thing is it precisely contradicts the social constructionist hypothesis. Well, I think that people generally think of Christianity as science for stupid people. It's something like that. You know, and it's often reduced to its more fundamentalist manifestation. So, you know, the straw man version of Christianity is fundamentalist Protestantism of the sort that makes the case that the Bible is literally true and that the cosmos is roughly several thousand years old. Well, it's easy to make fun of that. I'm not sure it's so wise to make fun of it. I mean, people generally have reasons for what they believe, and sometimes it's fear and narrow-mindedness and ignorance, but sometimes what might appear to be fear and narrow-mindedness and ignorance is actually the attempt to preserve something of extraordinary value, the value of which has not been fully articulated.
I mean, I think that's one of the gigantic problems that a lot of people have with education, that you're learning facts, you're learning information, but you're not learning how to use your own mind.
Yeah, well, here's something that's really interesting about that. So I spent a lot of time, I'm a scientist, but I would say I'm also a religious person. I'm a deeply religious person. And
how do you reconcile those?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, and I've spent 40 years thinking about that. And for 20 of those years, I did almost nothing but think about that all the time. And I realized something, partly from reading Carl Jung. And what I realized was that even the fundamentalists have the wrong idea about religious truth. Religious truth is not scientific truth, like the stories in Genesis, which are very old stories, maybe tens of thousands of years old. They're obviously not scientific theories because the people who wrote them weren't scientists. We didn't have science until about 500 years ago. So the idea that the stories in Genesis are scientific theories is it's just false on every possible front. And so then you might say, well, there's no other truth but scientific truth. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not true. Because what scientific truth tells you is what things are. But genuine religious truth tells you how you should act. And those things are not the same. And so a great story, like a great novel, which is a quasi-religious construction because it's like a distillation of ordinary life into its most important elements. That's a map about how you should comport yourself in the world. I feel bad for the millennials. They've been taught by these politically correct types ever since they were little. I mean, and this is really happening in Canada at an extraordinarily rapid rate. You have institutions like the Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education, which is an absolutely appalling institution in my estimation. And, you know, they've produced non-stop political activists in the guise of teachers who've been teaching this nonsense to young people, you know, right from elementary school forward. I mean, what the hell do we expect? And then in the United States, they've taken these millennials and, you know, ratcheted up their tuition costs and then force them into a kind of indentured servitude.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason that they're being kowtowed to, you know, because you can't declare bankruptcy on your student loans in the United States, eh? So the young people are being enticed into mortgaging their future, just like indentured slaves were when they were, or indentured servants were when they were taken from Europe 200 years ago.
Yeah,
So,
I owe my soul to the company store.
That's right. That's right. You know, and so, and then the millennials, the anxious social justice warrior types who want protection, you know, they push and say, well, this frightens me. Maybe I should be protected. And the administration and the faculty goes, oh, yes, that really is scary. We really should protect you. And all it does is validate their fear. And these people aren't very old, and, you know, and they need some guidance. That's what the hell university's for. That and to protect, maintain, and expand the culture instead of taking bloody axe swings at its roots,
Right.
which is what's happening now.
Well, if
It's
there's
not good.
If there's one thing, I think the one thing society needs almost more than anything is entrepreneurs. That's what innovates. That's what pays your mortgage. And it's a rare trait.
Yeah.
But if there's one thing an entrepreneur needs to have, that's the ability to fail. I estimate you have 12 failures for every success. We had balloons here on the show earlier. 12 failures for every success. If you can't handle failure, you're doomed as an entrepreneur, and a society without entrepreneurs is doomed.
Yeah, well, and yeah. The students are protected from failing. And I mean, there's incredible pressure, for example. And you see this, another thing that's happening on the campuses is that the accessibility people are raging completely out of control too. So we're enticing students continually on campus to claim disabilities, to claim impairment in their performance associated with disabilities at an ever expanding rate, instead of just using objective criteria by which to judge people. And the problem the problem with that is that authority should should mimic the real world, so to speak. So if you're a parent, you should interact with your children in approximately the same manner that the harsh social world and nature is going to interact with them. So what you do is you discipline your children when they're doing things that are going to hurt them if they do them in the real world.
Right.
And you should be doing that with students too. It says the standards should be there as an analog of the standards that are going to confront them in their marriages and their friendships and their business relationships and all of that. And okay, now liberals are higher in openness, which is both interest in ideas and interest in aesthetics, and they're lower in conscientiousness. And one of the consequences of that is that they tend to make better entrepreneurs and artists. And so our society is basically set up, and this is something people really need to think about. I do consulting work for this company called the Founder Institute, and we've tested 40,000 would-be entrepreneurs from all over the world, 165 different cities. Mm-hmm. It's the biggest early-stage tech incubator in the world now. The guy who runs it, Adeo Resi, has created 2,500 new businesses in 4 years doing this. And we know what predicts entrepreneurial ability. And so the liberals are really interested in how ideas relate to one another, and they like to jump from one thing to another. And it does make them more creative, but they're not very good at implementation. Whereas the conservatives are very good at implementation and at detail. And so roughly speaking, the conservatives need the liberals to start companies and to generate new ideas, even though a lot of those ideas are going to be bad.
Right.
Okay, but the liberals need the conservatives to run the damn companies. Now, you can be temperamentally conservative and temperamentally liberal. And those are valid viewpoints because there's a place for those viewpoints in the world. They can function as tools. But what you have to do is exactly what you just said. If you're a conservative, you need to listen to the liberals because they have some things to tell you. And the liberals, and I think they're far worse at this at the moment, by the way, the liberals have to learn to listen to the conservatives because the conservatives hold things together and stabilize things.
Right.
Yeah, well, so the dialogue. Now, the reason free speech is so important is because liberals and conservatives have to communicate in order to keep society going. And it's communication that's central to free speech. You have to be able to talk to each other. So people are possessed by a question, and it's part of our nature to be possessed by this question. And so you can think about this as an archetypal question, if you like. And the question is, what are we doing here? And you can ask yourself that in relationship to this conference. You're here to search for meaning and to understand what that might mean. But you also might ask yourself, well, why is it that you have to be here for your search for meaning? Why is that something that drives human beings? It isn't characteristic, for example, of animals. They don't seem to question their existence. And so there's something about the very nature of human being that makes us feel as if something needs to be set right. When that's being discussed historically, it's been associated with the term redemption. People are in need of redemption. In the modern age, we talk about positive psychology, and we talk about happiness, which is a much weaker word. But our forefathers had a more profound sense of the problematic state of human existence, and they used more profound words. And the idea that we have a need for redemption is a more profound idea. Human beings, and I'm going to talk mostly about human beings in the West because that's the literature that I'm most familiar with. Human beings in the West have been meditating on the nature of human being for thousands of years. Perhaps ever since we became self-conscious, which is another thing that distinguishes us from animals, and another thing that drives our search for meaning. The consequence of this meditation, or one of the consequences of this meditation, has been the production of a series of books that people know as the Bible. I realized years ago that people saw the world through lenses of belief. And more recently, it's been demonstrated that that's actually inevitable because you're a limited cognitive processor. You have to frame your perceptions with beliefs. What I learned is that the belief systems that people use to frame their perceptions have a structure, and that structure is religious. A religious presupposition is one that you might even not notice that you make. It's a predicate or an axiom or an assumption. And the study of those axiomatic assumptions is what religion is about. Now, one of your axiomatic assumptions, for example, is that life involves a search for meaning, and that's associated with the idea of redemption. And you'll notice that you asked that question because, of course, you're here. But you might not notice how strange it is that all of you asked that question. And the fact that all of you asked that question, that human beings have asked that question for as far back as we can understand, is indicative of something profound about human nature. It's lack of completion.